12th Aero, and there they are in the photo album that I looked at the Air Force Academy, our cameras. This, folks, is the purpose of that entire operation right there. That suite of cameras you see there. You see a nice comparison of the 26 centimeter with the Grand Champ. That's the overall panoramic. And then you have your mainstay, 50 to 52 centimeters. And then you have in this one, the Durham. Durham was a very successful aerial observer for the French forces. He shot down personally 4 German airplanes in his role as an observer. He came up with this automatic camera, which basically had the ability to photograph using a compartment of 50 plates, which was very impressive. It did have its problems, but the Americans liked what they saw, and they acquired Durhams for the airplanes. Now, it's a heavy camera, about 100 pounds. But the point from all this is that you can see them transitioning towards the end of the war to camera suites that allow them to do the film independently while they are in turn defending the airplane. So the unsung hero of the First World War is a guy who basically had all the burden on him regarding capturing the right targets from the use of aerial photography, checking out what is happening in terms of the battle, and relaying that information to the decision maker. That was your aerial observer. And what you find towards the end of the war is they're phasing out the aerial observer, or they're hard to find, because it was a very dangerous job. If you're going to be a pilot, at least you have the ability to use your wits and fly that plane to safety, or what you're seeing in the transition we'll discuss shortly, is you're able to fly single-seaters at a higher altitude. That way you escape not only the enemy fighters, but you also escape the improving anti-aircraft artillery, such as the 88. But in this case, you have a statement of fashion. This is for you, Aaron. Marin Parasol L, shown here, is one of the many platforms. I'm not trying to degrade the role of aviation, but I wanted to portray my discussion of aeroplanes that these were aerial platforms for the systems that they employed to get the information to the commanders. When you look at the genesis, the BE-2A in this case, what you find is a plane developed by a committee, BE Blériot Experimental. The gentleman in the center is one of the leading figures of the Royal Flying Corps, Sefton Brancker. He became the Royal Flying Corps' #1 man in the War Office, while General Henderson and Trenchard and such were in the front area. An interesting comment about this shot. The 13th of April was the 100th birthday of the Royal Flying Corps. So here I am, a Yank, calling up all my friends in Britain. Anybody commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Royal Flying Corps, which comes to the Royal Air Force, which saved you in the Battle of Britain? There was one article in the Telegraph, and that's where this photograph came from. It's an amazing statement, you know. Here I am, wave my hands. Come on, folks, commemorate your legacy. So, there it is. But anyway, what you find intriguing about one of these first aerial platforms, and Dick mentioned it briefly, you have the pilot sitting in the rear cockpit, and you have the observer sitting in the front. So you can imagine trying to observe, peeking out over that bottom wing, and maybe you have a handheld camera. Well, you got to get that attitude just right to get that snap you need for the mission. More effectively was obviously the pusher FE2D in this case, a much more powerful motor applied. This was the first British airplane to have a camera internal. But you see, the Brits had to hang their camera outside the fuselage. Fascinating discussion about British aerial design. It's like an F-15. The F-15 was designed around the radar. In Britain, they built the fuselage, and then they worried about where the camera was going to go. In France, they designed their airplanes around the camera. Now, Alan and I can get in an argument about the SPAD, but the point is that SPAD was able to internalize a camera. And in this case, you have a fuselage is wide enough, and I have a photograph in the book of a 47-inch camera that went out the nose of an FE2. But the point for you folks is that you're thinking about the observer there flying along, let's say at 80 miles an hour, probably has a seatbelt on, hopefully, and he's trying to operate that camera system. All of a sudden, some enemy is coming out of the sky after him. Not the most enjoyable lifespan. So here we are. This is the French equivalent, the Maurice Farman 11 bis. It's been in operation from 1913 to 1917. A lot of configurations. What you see here is the crew from the Escadrille Maurice Farman 69. They're trying out a new way to configure their 120 centimeter camera to get some more optical shots of the front lines. And a beautiful shot of the rear gives you a clear, definitive look of how the 120 looked from the rear. And again, there's your observer. Yeah, he'll take the photos in due time, but he wants to make sure they get back alive. This is a statement for the Operational Safety and Health Association, OSHA, because this is how you load 120 centimeter into a Maurice Farman in normal configuration. By the way, Alan, thank you for that photo. In this case, you have a SPAT 11, a normal two-seater, acquiring its 50 centimeter in. The person that was signed off was the photographic officer. It was his job to make sure that the camera was in place and done effectively configured. There's one story where the photographic officer forgot to take off the lens cap. They flew the sortie, the aircrew found out about it. That guy had to buy rounds at the bar for a week. I call this shot do or die. Here is an RE-8 Reconnaissance Experimental 8. This was the mainstay and reconnaissance platform for the British from 1917, 1918. It wasn't pretty, but it was very, very rugged. And what I love about the shot is you look at the expressions. There's the pilot, very cocky. There's the observer. And then you have the maintenance crew over there. And the observer and the maintenance crew look absolutely exhausted. But the point is, that was not an easy life. Because when you find what are the highest target priorities from the fighters, it's to take out the reconnaissance airplanes. One of the best airplanes in the world, and Alan wrote the book, Brigade 14. This is the first brigade that showed up in the front lines, Brigade 7, Escadrille 7. What I love about the shot is, look how confident those crew look. They got a great plane. It's a very well-built plane, very well configured and structured. It could take a beating, and oh, by the way, it provided a higher altitude coverage that they needed. But my favorite airplane in the inventories is the Samson. And it was the reconnaissance platform of preference for both the French and the Americans. And this is one of the first training efforts going on where the French basically taught the Americans the role of reconnaissance. What we don't understand is the role that France did play in shaping our military, particularly aviation. Because we came over with an expedition to Mexico, and when we got here, it was the French that took us under their wings and taught the basics. And you see here is a mix. The photo album shows some of the names there. But this is Escadrille 1, Samson 1, which went by the name of Escargot. This is the first squadron, first Aero Squadron's Samson. That was their emblem, was the American flag. TSF is their wireless. Transmission without fiber, that's what TSF stands for. The genesis of aviation is shown here. This is your first Aero Squadron's Samson. Today, the first Aero Squadron is represented by your Global Hawk, your U-2, and at one time the SR-71 in Beale Air Force Base. So the legacy continues on. As for drones, for the most part, everybody gets a piece of that action, so we don't really have to say the Predator is a direct line from the first Aero. Let's say from Allrecchi. This is a very unique situation because it leads to the discussion of how we see reconnaissance evolving. In this case, Sgt Willis was one of the aviators on the Lafayette Escadrille. And he basically tested what was the capabilities, in this case, of a SPAD 7 to do not only air-to-air, but possibly aero-recce. And so he acquires a Type C British camera, and he puts it into the fuselage of his plane, and he takes off in a sortie. No discussion if he did take any actual photos or whatever, but this is a Allied effort. French airplane, British camera, American pilot. Willis becomes commissioned later, and if you ever type his name into Google, you'll find out he writes in incredible detail. He was shot down in 1918. He managed to escape Germany by swimming the Rhine River into Switzerland. So that was like the October or November of 1918, but it's all on Google. Okay, so what we have here is photographic evidence that the SPAD did indeed carry a camera system, in this case 50 centimeter. Now, would anybody like to venture a guess what that ball is right there? That's your stabilization device for the camera. You know what it is? A tennis ball. They have the device that kind of holds it, so as you're moving, you know, energy and vibration and such, you've got to make sure that camera is a stable platform. Because if you've ever taken photographs and you move, guess what? You get a blur. So this was one French approach to how to stabilize. We're not going to get in an argument here. Al and I just love going over and over. I always like to throw it at him that the 94th Aero Squadron, the greatest fighter squadron of the First World War, was going to acquire a recce roll. In this case, you see the photo compartment. That was standard for the SPAD 13. But the irony of it is that if you look at the evidence, if we had had to go into 1919, I think you would have seen every aviator acquiring some responsibility for photographic aerial reconnaissance. Why? Because you're leaving a positional war in 1919 and going into a more maneuverable operational war, possibly entering into Germany. Any possible recce resource would have required that they would provide information to that rapidly expanding FLOT and FIBA. So, Alan, we can yell about that later. How's that sound? I want to conclude on platforms on this one. What you see here is the unsung hero of reconnaissance in World War I. Why? Because the Russians built it. It's the largest reconnaissance platform of the war, the Ilya Muromets. The thing about this particular plane is it was developed in 1912. He flew it in 1913. They were operational in 1914. It had an incredible range, and it flew at a higher altitude. It was initially designed as a reconnaissance platform for the Russians. Oh, by the way, they said, well, why don't we put some bombs on it? So they did near real-time battle damage assessment, photographing with their in-bay cameras the bombs that were dropping from the plane and determining the level of destruction from those photographs. The Germans called this plane the Sikorsky, because it was Sikorsky that designed it. And he eventually left Russia, went to the United States, and he developed the P-47. So here we are. Those are platforms. I want to give you a basic introduction to how that information is consolidated through interpretation and restitution. What you're looking at here is an actual plate. It's the only one I've ever held in my hand. Got my Kodak Brownie and put it up to the light and click, and there you see how that was in actual form as it was processed. In this case, this is one of the areas, target sets in Belgium. But you can see all the destruction. This was the format of the photographs that came out of the French and the Americans, 13 by 11 centimeters or 13 by 18 centimeters or 18 by 24 centimeters. Those were the standards. And come the last few weeks of the war, the Allies made a decision that this was going to be the standard for all photography. The British had a 4.5 inch by 5 inch photograph coming from their camera systems. So the photographs are taken, they're developed anywhere you can provide a camouflage area, and oh, by the way, you need to have running water. But this case, well, I can't see it very well here, but when the photograph was taken, what they do is they do the analysis they do the interpretation using this wax paper, and they annotate what exactly are the targets off of that wax paper. They take that wax paper off and they put it onto a same scale map. They'll do a series of photographs like a mosaic, put them together. So if you're running along the line, you're photographing one after another, make it simultaneous. Then you usually photograph that one so you can have one photograph to work with. But this is how they did the analysis throughout the war. Again, nothing revolutionary in photography. Now, it all goes together on the map. It's a cartographical conflict. This is how they managed the battles in World War I, making sure the maps were up to date with the information. Anybody want to venture a guess where this was taken? How does Cornell University sound? The first school of photographic interpretation in the United States. And even Cornell didn't know that. So here we have areas of coverage. How do you manage all this intelligence data? You have lots of photographs. You need to know where each one was taken, when it was taken. Oh, by the way, what is the area of coverage? These are called Keymaps. Towards the end of the war, they got their act together fairly well when they flew a sortie line, such as you're seeing here. In this case, they're using the 20, let me see, that's the 26 centimeter Grand Champ. That's the camera. One was higher altitude, one was a lower altitude. What you see with the coverage there, each